Hi everyone, welcome back. Today is our last seminar of the quarter. We have saved the best for last. So to end up in a really good note, today we have the pleasure of having Sabrina Bradbury coming and telling us a little bit about the bike sharing and bike firms in the Sacramento region. She is a Senior Program Manager at SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, and have been working on fostering people and services in the region for a few years now. Working a lot on transportation demand management programs, funding innovative and cool services in the region, trying to get people out of the vehicles, maybe trying to get space for cars and allocate it to active transportation modes. So I'm really happy that we have Sabrina today telling us a little bit more about what's going on in our region. Sabrina, thank you so much for coming. And we're all yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, bike share and shared micromobility more broadly. I will get into a bit too. So I'm going to start off with talking about some background and history of bike share in our region, and then I'll touch on the state of shared micromobility industry more broadly. From chatting with some of you at lunch, I think some of you might know more than I do about some of this. And then I'll spend the bulk of the time talking about what we've learned over the last few years having bike share in the region and looking at trends, challenges, and opportunities in the industry, and then give you a little peek at what's next in the region. So how did we get here? Well, it started in 2013, even before that really, but in 2013, regional partners received a grant from a SACOG funding round to launch bike share in Sacramento, Davis, and West Sacramento. And that includes university partners, so UC Davis, Sac State, the Three Cities, of course, the Air District, and a number of other partners who have worked on this. And we developed a solicitation to select a vendor, and that went out in about 2015, 2016, request for proposal, and we selected Social Bicycles, SOBI, at the time. And we had planned to launch a system that would be publicly owned, the capital investment of buying the bikes and the parking, the stations for the bike share system, and that we would contract with SOBI for the operations side of it through a revenue sharing agreement. And so we took that agreement to our board in 2017, and about that time was when venture capital backed companies were coming into cities, sometimes without permission, and dropping bikes and saying, oh, we can bring you bike share for free, no public subsidy needed. And so our elected officials rightly asked, well, why are we entering into this contract to pay a vendor when we have these companies that are willing to offer bike share for free? So we went back and negotiated, shifted our business model a little bit with SOBI, and decided to invest in bike parking that could be used by any bicycle. So it wasn't bike share specific necessarily. And that would be our only capital investment. And so we agreed to take on the bike capital. They would continue to own the bikes and operate the system. So they were taking on more of the risk and costs. And then we still had, service level agreements, and there was still a public-private partnership. And so we worked toward launching in May of 2018, but right before we launched, the market shifted once again, and Uber bought Jump, which were the e-bikes that SOBI had come out with. And so I've seen a lot of heads nodding, so you might know some of this history. So we had the opportunity, it actually worked out really great in a lot of ways, that we got to launch at what was at the time the largest all electric assist system in North America. And so we had 300 bikes to start across the 3 cities and quickly ramped up to 900 bikes. And end of 2018, beginning of 2019 is when you started seeing e-scooters come on the scene. So in 2019, we were probably about 1,000 bikes across the 3 cities, and we saw phenomenal ridership. We became, by the end of the year, we were Jump's second top market globally in terms of total trips, coming in second after Paris. And then, of course, in 2020, the pandemic hit. And so we were pulled the fleet. There were a couple of other operators for scooters. It was kind of a separate, SACOG has the contract for bike share services, and the scooter operators are a bit separate. I'll kind of touch on that later. And then Uber turned operations over to Lime, and we spent the summer of 2020 renegotiating with Lime on getting bikes back out in the 3 cities. And so this was, all of this is to say there's been a lot of dynamics in the marketplace. And so I'll kind of head into state of the industry to touch on this a little more. Generally, there are kind of 3 buckets of operating models, but the bike share systems can kind of fall in between these as well. So when we were first launching when we were getting the grant funding to procure a bike share system, there were a lot more nonprofit and publicly owned systems. And then, like I mentioned, there was kind of that shift towards the privately owned and privately operated systems that it looked like the private sector might have been trying to figure out how they could make this pencil financially and not require as much public investment. And then there's publicly owned but privately contracted out, which was kind of that model we were originally going towards. I have some examples here where Healthy Ride is in Pittsburgh, so they're a nonprofit owned and operated. Then Lyft, I honestly don't know if they're still here, but this not too long ago they had launched in Santa Monica, and then Nice Ride is in Minneapolis, and they're public nonprofit owned, but Lyft is now the private operator there. So this gets to the economics of bike share and kind of what we've seen in the industry over the last few years with all of these shifts. This is information from a North American Bike Share and Scooter Share Association data that they collect from their members. And so it's public agency or nonprofit owned bike share systems. And you can see that on the revenues side that about 50% of the revenues come from ridership fees or member dues, and the rest is made up with sponsorships, grant funding, or subsidies of some kind. And so it's not really surprising when you look at this that the private sector wasn't able to just make bike share work financially on its own right. And on the operations side, you can see that rebalancing and just the rebalancing and the vehicle maintenance are a substantial cost. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room you can do there. You can only get so slim on your costs of what you're going to pay people to rebalance and maintain vehicles. So we did a scan of a lot of different bike share systems over the last year, different operating models. I haven't found any that have a system that doesn't require some level of sponsorship or subsidy to keep it going. But there is a case for investing in these, right? And I'll touch on this again a little bit later, but you might ask, well, if scooters are financially viable, that companies are making a profit on those, do we need bike share? Do we need to invest in it? And I argue, yes. The more options that we can provide people, the better, because there are different users and different use cases for the vehicles. Bike share e-bike trips tend to be an average about 2 miles per trip, whereas scooter trips average around a mile. And so there might be people who use a different device based on the type of trip that they're making. And then, or you might be like me and just prefer bikes over scooters. And I'm not as likely to go grab a scooter, even if they were widely available, as I would be to grab a bike, and vice versa. And they both show great benefits in terms of trip reduction, and 36% of shared micromobility trips are replacing car trips. And so, and this even aligns with some of the research that some of you are familiar with, that Dylan Fitch and others have done, some of you in this room have done, that we've seen that in our region too with our bike share system. So what have we learned about our region specifically? I'm going to touch on these topics: placemaking matters, investing in the infrastructure, and then investing in the operations side and why that's important. That bike share can serve multiple public policy goals, and talk a little bit about what the market potential is for our region. So what I mean by placemaking matters is that we need to have the right mix of land uses that puts the origin, the destinations that people are trying to come and go from, in places that make sense for a bike or a scooter trip distance. And people need to feel safe being able to make those trips. So even if you're close to a destination, you might not want to bike there. I'm thinking of when I lived in Roseville, and the Safeway wasn't very far, but it was on a very busy boulevard that I'd have to go down for probably a quarter of a mile, half a mile. So it's really important for policymakers and jurisdictional staff to think about where should they be investing to get the land uses to make sense, but also just some safe bicycling infrastructure. And this does not, it's not just the urban core, right? It's not just on the grid or here in Davis where you already have amazing bicycle infrastructure. There are lots of small towns, rural suburban areas where you could, a city or county could put in a protected bikeway that could do quite a lot for making people feel safer. And when we talk about investing in infill areas, again, I just like to highlight that it's not only in urban areas. When we talk about infill at SACOG, we're talking about any town center or place where there might be some open land that's near other developed area. So it's just trying to fill out the places that you already have rather than expanding things out further into more open space, because there's a lot of opportunity to create vibrant places and communities. And we've seen this influx of, maybe influx isn't the right word, but thinking of, I have neighbors across the street who moved from the Bay Area a year ago. And we know that our region is one of the fastest growing in the state. There are people that are looking to leave more urban areas, but it doesn't mean that they don't want to be able to walk and bike around their communities. So it's really important to think about how we make those investments and then adding bike and scooter infrastructure as part of that. And these projects can be very expensive and take a really long time with environmental review. And so we like to promote pop-up and demonstration projects that you might do with some paint and some pylons, some signs to just make a slow street. The City of Sacramento had a number of those at the beginning of the pandemic. And you can really start out small, and it can create some energy in the community to keep going in that direction. Once they see a temporary protected bike lane, they're probably going to want to see more of that longer term. So it doesn't end at investing in the infrastructure. It's also important to think about investing on the operations side of bike share. Once you have the infrastructure investments and land use investments to complement that, then you really need to think about the public or sponsorship investment opportunities that you might be able to draw in for a bike share system to really get at the public policy goals. Because the private sector, while as well-intentioned as they might be in wanting to achieve public policy goals, they're ultimately going to need to turn a profit. And if their system isn't able to do that, they're going to prioritize putting bikes and services in the places where they're going to get most ridership and not necessarily serving equity goals that you might have. And the cost effectiveness of investing in these systems, I think, is really big. You can see from this chart that I had earlier, when you think about it from a public transit side, where we invest in public transit already and think about shared micromobility as an extension of that, the fare box recovery is pretty good. 40 to 50% is higher than you would see with traditional public transit. And so you really get a good bang for your buck in terms of what you put into the system versus what society pays. I just found this graphic that I think is illustrative of the amount that we're subsidizing in different modes that bike share and scooter share really come at a pretty low cost when you consider the public benefit that they bring. So why should we invest in bike share and or scooter share, and not just put in more bike infrastructure is a question that has come up for us as well. And to this, I would say that it really exposes more people to an option where they might not be willing to go out and buy a bike, especially an e-bike. They're really expensive. And so if somebody can try an e-bike for a few dollars and see that it's fun, it's easy to get around, they can ride it on a hot day and not feel like they just worked out as hard, that's going to continue to grow that culture of bicycling and scooting around as opposed to just hopping in their car. If you see them around and they're easily available, it's going to go a lot further than having to think through like, oh, where am I going to get a bike or buy a bike? So moving on to the public policy benefits, that shared micromobility systems can help you achieve multiple goals. And we've been really focused on thinking about the economic benefits and how shared micromobility systems can really be a huge civic amenity. There's quite a few studies out now showing that people are spending more when they're out on bikes and scooters compared to driving through an area. You might be more willing to stop for a cup of coffee on your way to your destination as opposed to just driving straight through, or a local shop that didn't catch your eye before you pop in and buy something. And then, of course, the environment, reducing vehicle miles traveled and car trips is of huge significance for SACOG in particular. One of our core functions is to meet the California greenhouse gas reduction emissions targets. And so we're hugely focused on the opportunities that bike share and shared micromobility bring for trip reduction. And then, of course, equity, providing more access to the destinations that people need and want to go is hugely important. And I think this one in particular, as I touched on before, we're not going to be able to rely on the private sector to achieve our objectives around providing greater access to opportunity and transportation options, because a lot of the underserved and disinvested communities are in areas that are not always, but can be lower density, and it's going to cost more for providers to have a bigger service area. So we have to think about what is the area that we want to serve, what communities would like to have bike share and scooter share. We want to be talking to those communities and see if they actually want it. And that all takes a lot of time, energy, costs that the private sector is not going to invest. And then finally, the potential for a shared micromobility market. It was really strong in 2019. As I said, we had phenomenal ridership. In, I think it was June of 2019 that we had over 140,000 trips on the jump system. That's more than some bike share systems see in a whole year from what I found, which I didn't realize at the time just how amazing that ridership was. We had over 1,000 bikes by the spring of 2020 when the fleet was full. And so while the pandemic has dampened that ridership and kind of slowed our ability to get more devices out, I do think that over the longer term, we'll see that bounce back. When we look at data from all of we have a pretty small number of bikes out right now, about 300 bikes in West Sacramento and Sacramento, but there are thousands of scooters in those two cities. And so the total trips taken is probably about 65% of what it was pre-pandemic, which really isn't bad considering so many people are still working from home and where those trips were happening in the grid. But we have a lot going for us, and this is why I think there's a lot of potential to come back even stronger than we were before. We have a cycling community that is really strong. Davis is kind of the center of it, right? So I know you're familiar with that. We have 5 operators. This might actually be 4 now because Spin recently pulled out of the Sacramento market. But there's been a lot of interest from scooter operators in even going into some of our suburban communities like Woodland, Elk Grove, Rancho Cordova. I feel like there's another one, but nothing has launched in those communities yet, but it's all to say that there is a lot of interest from the private sector. And then of course we have this beautiful winter weather outside that is very warm and pleasant and flat topography. So it's just really everything you can think of to make for a perfect cycling environment. So what's next? We're working with partners to think about what do we want bike share to look like in the region, and then how do we get there? And so we've been doing this research on what are the different operating models, what are the pros and cons with those models, and what direction do we want to go to get at our policy goals around environment, equity, and economy. And at this point in time, Lyman is still the operator of the bike share system. And we are in ongoing discussions with them about a relaunch in Davis. As I mentioned, that finances side of it. Scooters are not currently allowed in Davis. And so we've just been having a lot of discussion with them about, well, what would it take to do a bike share only system? Or how many, what's the fleet mix that you would need in terms of number of scooters versus bikes? And I don't have a launch date for you yet, but hopefully we'll be able to share something soon. And then our contract with them is up for an option to renew at the end of this calendar year. And we want to do our due diligence and see what are the options that the private market is willing to bring to us, and also thinking about nonprofit and publicly owned system and what would that cost us. And so we're developing a solicitation to also go out to bid this year. So it wouldn't preclude us from renewing our contract with Lime, but we want to get more information from the marketplace about what our different options are so that we can take that back to policymakers and have them give us direction on a path forward. So that concludes my presentation. I would be happy to answer any questions and dive into discussion. Actually, I think I have a question for you first. How many have tried bike share in the region? Okay, fair amount. And how many prefer bikes over scooters? About the same number of people. Well, let's open it up. Thank you so much.
Question, Justin?
You showed a slide that had the different mode types, how much it costs society versus $1 that the person pays. But what does that dollar measure? Like for walking, is that like you wear out your shoes or?
I interpreted this, and I didn't put together this graphic, but I interpreted this as what the public investment is for like sidewalks. Oh, you mean the dollar of what you pay to walk?
Yeah, you pay like, nobody pays to walk
Yeah, that's a
directly.
good point.
So I was
It
just
looks like a
curious.
flaw in their graphic.
But I guess if you add up like all the indirect costs, like shoe leather, I guess. Food.
Produced by Discourse Media. We made it look prettier, but yeah, I'd have to go dig up their research report there. But I think probably what you're saying
Well,
that
I'm
you need.
curious because that's a pretty powerful difference between walking, biking, and the motorized modes. So you know that could be a really good thing to show people. That's why I was curious.
Yes.
Did you?
Sure. You go ahead. You have that split of operating costs, the share of different costs on one of the slides.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, maintenance costs were about 22%. That seems pretty high for bike maintenance. My understanding from whatever limited I've seen in that sector is that usually in shared bikes, that cost should not exceed about 12-15%. So I was just wondering if you have, if SACOG has actually looked into what's causing those maintenance costs, what are the elements that are adding up to it? Do you also include, for example, downtime of a particular bike? Sometimes it needs to be taken off the fleet depending on the kind of issue that it faces. So do you include downtime in that maintenance cost? Because then I would imagine that cost being that number, because a bike lost for every day is a high cost.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if how you interpret or understand that particular segment, and then I have one more question after that.
Sure. So this was prepared by the North American Bike Share and Scooter Share Association, and I believe it's from surveying their members that are public and nonprofit organizations. So it's probably some kind of fuzzy sum, an average of what they're seeing across multiple different operators. I'd be happy to connect you with the staff over there if you wanted to dig into that.
Yeah, sure. That would be helpful. The other thing I was wondering is you talked about the importance of the city, if I understand it correctly, making the infrastructure investments, and then you have the private sector that actually makes the operating cost investments. So when you look at this cost story, are your infrastructure readiness investments that are required to make these operations viable included in that narrative, or that's a separate story?
Included in the cost here?
Yeah, is it somewhere amortized into operating costs, or no, or that's just considered public investment?
Yeah, completely separate, and really varies by community in the region in terms of where they're at with the infrastructure investments. Like Davis obviously is off the charts compared to a lot of other cities in our region and other regions. So yeah, that's separate from, this is just on the operations.
Okay. Which leads me to the question, sorry, do you at your end as a public entity what do you look as metrics to decide whether the readiness investment that you need to make for a particular region or area to make this operation viable is justified or not justified?
That's a great question. I mean, we haven't really had to approach that before just because we've had more of this privately owned and operated system. And so it's a little bit of working with that operator and seeing how big they're willing to make the service area. We did have some work where we were working with Folsom, Rancho Cordova, and Elk Grove to launch a suburban bike share pilot. And it never got off the ground because it was 2019 when there started to be a lot of consolidation of vendors, and we had selected Gotcha, and they ended up wanting to pull out of the contract because it wasn't going to be enough money for them to make it pencil. And so I think that we're still learning a lot about what level of infrastructure investment do you need. We've tried to think about it as, you know, where do you have a business center or like town center in your area that you might start a smaller pilot and then expand it over time where as you build out the infrastructure to support it.
Okay, last question.
That's
So one last.
Okay.
I just need to. So also because I realized we have a little more time than usual. But that's just as a stretch goal. Does the public entity in your vision envisage asking bike share companies to utilize, let's say, electric vans to do the rebalancing of bikes because they often use IC engine vehicles to do that? Is that something that's, I know it's hard to implement, but is that something in consideration for at some point?
Definitely, it has been in discussions. It's not something in our current contract, but definitely something we're thinking about.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
What's the long-term plan for bike sharing? Is it a plan to transition to a place where more people own bikes privately, or is for the foreseeable 50, 60, 70 years where we continue to rely on these companies to provide the service?
Great question. I wish I had an answer for you. I think, you know, if I were to decide a place like this campus, for example, where you have so many students coming in who buy a beater bike or something and then ditch it once they're done with their 2 to 4 years, right? I see bike share being a long-term viable option in places like that. In other places, maybe it makes sense to not have a bike share system at all, just because there's not the density there, and you focus more on, is there a way to subsidize people to purchase their bikes? But I do think that that can only go so far as well, because then people need to be committed to maintaining that bike. And especially when you start talking e-bikes, that could be very expensive. So yeah, I think that over the long term, bike share is something that will continue to exist. What the operating model will be of that, I think, is an open question in terms of how much of it is seen as a worthy public investment, publicly owned and operated, or nonprofit, versus relying on the private sector. We shall see. Me?
To me, it feels like there's been a lot of volatility in the bike share market, about micromobility, especially with COVID. In retrospect, does SACOG feel like it would have been a better route to have a dedicated fleet of bicycles and not rely on these companies to come in to the area and provide bike sharing?
I honestly could go either way on that. I think we had the benefit of being able to launch an all electric assist system. I don't think we would have had that if we hadn't gone this direction. But on the flip side, if we had bought the bikes, then, you know, maybe we would have left them out consistently during the pandemic for essential workers. But we would have also spent more public funds on at that time trying to make that work. So I don't know that there's necessarily regret. We're just looking for, given what we've learned, how do we keep getting better and being on the cutting edge of this ever-changing field?
My question is more about the use. How have you found maybe that gender or age has a preference or either or scooters or bikes? And in that sense, would that help redistribute maybe the service in different places? And joined to that, have you seen like maybe certain communities are more pro bicycle sharing and others more maybe not sharing at all? And how is the take on the maybe more demand side of the resource usage?
Yeah, I know that there's some good research on this. I have not taken a deep dive into that. The report that has this graphic in it that NAPSA comes out with each year, they're working on the 2021 report right now, but the 2020 report is out, and they always have some information about demographics of bike share users and scooter users broken out. I think the only trend I can think of that sticks out top of mind is that I think for bikes and scooters, it tends to be mostly male and, more affluent white male that is usually using the systems more than others. But I think it tends to be a younger demographic from what I recall, but go look at the report yourself to confirm, that uses scooters compared to bikes. I don't think it was a very drastic difference. But I don't know on the question of like, if there are some communities that prefer like shared use versus not shared use.
So along the lines of the bike scooter comparisons, it seems like vandalism is a big problem, in particular for scooters. I've seen all like videos of people throwing them in lakes and stuff like that, doing crazy things. I'm curious if that happens with bike share ever, or why you think it might be different between, because it doesn't seem like it does.
It does happen, definitely happens. I know, pre-scooter, I believe there was a few pictures of bikes being in replacement. So it definitely happens. I don't actually know if it's more or less frequent. I haven't asked Line that question.
The affordability and equity a little bit more. And if it's auditing and I'm from LA, and I know LA has a couple of bike share programs in the county, but I know that
well, our agreement with Line, the low income program, is actually free. The challenge is that you have to know where to go sign up for it. It's not just in the app. So I've leaned on them to, probably have something in the app, but I see why they don't. You have to go to their website, Line Access, but then it's if you are part of any other low income program, you just show evidence of that, and then you can get this Line Access that makes it free. So anyone that is on like Pell Grant would qualify for that low income program. On those standard user pricing, yeah, we've seen it continue to go up. We had really cheap pricing when we launched with Jump in 2018. In 2019, we agreed to a price increase that was less than the increases they were doing in some of their other markets, but was still more than what we were paying. And now the Walkup price, I think, is $1 to unlock and 32 cents a minute. I live in West Sacramento and our office is in downtown Sacramento. It's about a 4-mile trip. And I used to take the jump bike sometimes, especially on those 100-degree days. And it would cost me, $4 or a trip, maybe less, definitely less with our original pricing. Now it'd be $9 each way with that pricing. So I haven't made that trip. I think that's one that we're really interested in pushing on with soliciting the marketplace is what better pricing could we get for users? And that's also been something we've been leaning online in terms of what can they do with a minutes pass or like a monthly pass that has a certain number of minutes to reduce that per trip cost. I don't know if that answered your question fully.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah. I was thinking of the price and do you have in the contract maximum price maybe, or like a minimum price related to how much the public transit costs so that it doesn't compete with public transit and like other public investments the city has? And so how does the price of the service like doesn't compete with the other ones? Or is there
Like
no?
the price that the user is paying?
Yeah, like the fare to use it for one ride. Is it in any way related to the price of the public transit so that they don't compete with each other?
It is not, but that's something that we've been talking with partners about is how do we make it easier for, there's some bike share systems like Austin is kind of one that's leading the way where their bike share is part of their transit agency now. And so they're able to offer a monthly pass that is inclusive of, if they're not doing it yet, I know that's the direction they're going. So that's something we've been talking about is, if somebody's using this to connect to transit, I mean, yeah, then the cost of it is really quite high. And if you're trying to get people to not drive and parking isn't really that expensive, then you're gonna drive.
Oh, I was just gonna ask about the sponsorships. Is this like the part of the revenue is it venture capital funding or?
Well, this is for
Yeah.
nonprofits, so we don't have any info on the private operators, on how much of their funding comes from venture capital versus what the rider fees are covering.
And I don't know if you know much about it, but like, are these usually kind of like the time specific sponsorships, like until they're on their feet, or how does it work?
They are time specific. It's usually, 5 or 10 year period. And then that sponsor either resigns or you try and go find another sponsor.
Right.
So none of the systems have been able to make it pencil without some kind of sponsorship. In fact, some of the systems have, Denver used to have a public nonprofit, bike share system that they weren't able to get any sponsor to renew, and they ended up folding. And then the city decided to do a RFP, and they selected just 2 vendors, so they have like a limited market, so there's some incentive for the operators to follow the requirements that the city has around equity.
There's been a lot of really great questions about competition and pricing. I kind of want to double down on that. You said that there was 4 to 5 providers in Sacramento. What's SACOG's opinion about competition? How does it see, competition between both the bike share agencies and the transit taxis, Uber and Lyft? What's the plan there, I guess, is the question.
Well, on the different modes like transit and TNCs, I mean, I was saying earlier, anything that gets people to drive less, whether that's a TNC trip or your personal car, I'm in favor of that. There is gonna be some competition between transit and shared micromobility, right? Because some of those trips might have been and in fact, the graph shows that, right? Some shows that bike share is replacing transit trips more than scooter share. And I was also kind of surprised to see that scooters were higher on the auto driver or passenger trip reduction, and the rideshare taxi trip reduction. So yeah, there's gonna be some competition between these different non-car modes, but I think the more options that we can provide people that get it to be more normalized to not take your car, or maybe if you're in a dense enough city to not even own a car, then that's a good thing. In terms of competition between all the mobility providers, like having 4 or 5 scooter and bike share providers, I think there's pros and cons to it. On the one side, you might get, people are gonna have more options and they can choose from a provider that they like best. And some level of competition probably gets the players to, be more competitive on their pricing, for example. But from the public policy objectives, I think it gets harder when you have more and more operators that you're trying to manage your equity requirements, and enforcing that gets more challenging the more folks that you have, and you might be able to get more from a public policy perspective when you limit to 1 or 2 operators, because you could spend more time focused with them specifically. They're gonna have more buy-in because they have more market share, rather than it being split between 4 or 5 other operators.
Following on the question that Carolina was asking about integrating with public transit and things like that, that kind of touches on mobility as a service and super apps. Is the current thinking that that's something that the city would provide, that integration, or would you be more likely to contract that out to one of these companies that are trying to get into these mobility as a service apps?
I don't know if you have a recommendation for me.
Maybe I'll go start one of those.
A passion topic for me for years in terms of, I started at SACOG 14 years ago, and started out as the transportation demand management clerk. So a lot of processing invoices and more clerical type administrative support for the TDM program. And at the time we had, this very long-winded answer, apologies. At the time we had SAC Region 511 and SAC Region Commuter Club. And I think it took me a couple of years to figure out, what are these 2 places that I'm sending people, and how are they different, and why are they not the same? So one, SAC Region 511 was the traffic travel information. Commuter Club was the ride matching, carpooling, vanpooling, all your travel options really is supposed to spit out, transit and biking and walking and all of that as well. We have since merged them. It's now all SAC Region 511. But yeah, then you get into this, like, well, how do you make it even easier? And am I promoting a thing that people don't really care? Like they're gonna go to Google, right? And so how much should we invest as a public agency in developing some unique app versus pointing them to the things that already exist? And Google's already adding over time scooters, on there, and transit has been on there a while now. But that doesn't necessarily get at the payment integration side of all of these different modes. We're actually, SACOG is working with a couple other large NPOs to design a pricing and incentives pilot that will look at road pricing, like a mileage-based pricing and congestion pricing, and coupling that with subsidies and incentives for using alternative modes. And it overlaps a lot with what you think of mobility as a service. It's going to be a few years before we launch the pilot. We're just starting the design work for that. But that's definitely, I don't know what we're going to do in it, but it's something that we're thinking about and trying to figure out what is the best way to just make it easier for people to know what their options are.
Speaking to the topic of fare integration, in California, there's like a project to basically make it such that across the state, all the agencies eventually,
LITP.
yeah, exactly, will kind of be on the same program in regards to their fare system.
Right.
So I'm curious, kind of what is SACOG's involvement and how do you kind of see that future panning out for our region?
You know, I'm not heavily, I'm aware of the work happening, but I'm not like on any of the technical advisory committees for that. But I'm really just optimistic, like, yeah, that'd be great if we could figure that out, and we don't, you know, necessarily need to do anything there, because you can now just use your phone or your credit card to tap on to these different services. So we're more of a supportive role. I know regional transit is more active in piloting some of those technologies with Cal ITP. So we are kind of watching those different efforts and trying to navigate, like, where is the best place for us to bring in some resources versus seeing what others do and make sure we're not duplicating efforts, right?
Yeah, if I may, since we're on a bit of a transit item discussion right now, I've seen jump bikes riding across the causeway. And this leads me to kind of a question, how does SACOG or you individually believe shared mobility and device type can support regional mobility? Do you feel like shared mobility has a place to supporting regional mobility, or should that really all be focused into our local transit and encouraging better regional connectivity via our transit programming?
So you mean using bike share as a means to get around the
Like,
entire region versus?
You mentioned like Woodland is interested, and I know we see a large percentage of Woodland to Davis commuters.
Oh, gotcha.
Do you feel like bike share has any opportunity to address that need, or is that better like regionally wide to think about that as a transit need, not a micromobility need?
I hadn't thought about that, but really I think that, I mean, generally I've thought about that. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity to expand what our system has historically been in, you know, Sacramento, West Sacramento, and Davis. Looking back to what we had in 2019 and early 2020, we were starting to get into those discussions of like, oh, how far up, you know, to Natomas area are you willing to expand your service area? Or are you willing to go up the 50 corridor? But it wasn't so much, you know, I think the number of people who are going to come across the causeway or down the American River Trail is probably limited. So to me, that's just a co-benefit. I think most of the trips are probably going to be happening in those town center or around those like inner city trips. But I mean, with the regional trails network that we're doing, I don't know how much you're plugged into that. Yeah, there could be some huge opportunities for bike share and shared micromobility to connect people all over the region.
I'm curious if it's typical for other regions for like regional councils of government to be so involved in like managing and organizing bike share, or is that kind of more at the city level in other places, or just kind of what the governance structure is in other places that you come across?
It is not common for the regional organization to be involved. It usually is city, although there are some that just have different structures to their partnerships across. You know, it'll be like the transit agency crosses jurisdictions, and so, but they're the lead instead of a regional agency. MTC is a lead on the Bay Area bike share program, but then the cities are kind of also doing their separate things. So I think we're in that same model where West Sacramento and Sacramento kind of, you know, have their separate permit processes for scooter share. I think for particularly for Sacramento and West Sacramento, where there's just a bridge that's dividing the cities, right? And people are going to cross that bridge, so there's a little bit stronger need for it to be some sort of collective, collaborative effort, where, you know, Davis arguably could have a completely separate vendor and contract than what was set up. I think just at the time when we were looking to launch bike share, it was like, well, if we're going to attract a vendor, let's all be part of the same process so that we can maximize what we can get from the marketplace. But yeah, a lot of areas it is very much city or county led.
Going back to the question, last year, yeah, we were working with Caltrans on the I-80 for one of the classes. And they told us that some people were arguing for a dedicated bridge for the bike lane over I-80. And Caltrans did the counts, and it was just a handful of trips that were happening every day. So it would have been a really huge investment for 20 trips per day. Millions just to create that bridge. I think.
Yeah, but riding next to a highway is a really miserable experience.
Yeah. There
So
would
if
be
we
more
built something
trips.
that was more conducive to a relaxed environment, I think we could see a bigger
But it's
expanse.
already separated.
By a
And I know.
barrier, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a bike fan, I'm a full-blown bike advocate in the room, so, thank you.
I was gonna touch on the placemaking point, I guess. And because you do highlight it a lot, that it is very conducive to a good experience and a better use of the system. So maybe if you would mention what are the main elements that you see in the placemaking that would help success in these bike share programs?
I mean, I think the biggest one is just having very clear and protected, if you can, bike lanes, so that people feel comfortable whether they're scooting or biking. I think that's lacking in a lot of parts of our region. And then, you know, places and thinking about areas that either already have lower speed amount for cars where you can make those investments, or lowering the speed limit, that goes a long way too. Like, people don't, like, I am a pretty, you know, avid cyclist, and I don't want to ride on a boulevard that's 45 miles an hour where people are actually doing 55. So I think that is the biggest priority, is if you have areas like that where you can't reduce the speed limit, then making it a separated bikeway, but just prioritizing that, or at least bringing it on par with the car investments that are happening, would go a long way to people feeling more comfortable getting out on bikes. Oh, but don't forget about parking. Bike parking and scooter parking are very important investments too. So I didn't touch on that in my presentation, but it's one that has come up a lot with our partners, is that people are not, you know, we have dockless system, and even if you you make it a rule to walk to something, they're gonna walk to anything, they're gonna walk to that stop sign instead of the bike rack that's right here, right? So making sure that you have as much parking available, and if there's areas where you're not going to want to have a whole bunch of parking, like a more low density suburban area like East Sacramento or parts of residential Davis, right? That you, we had talked about piloting before Uber pulled the fleet in Davis, piloting the bikes parking perpendicular to the curb like a motorcycle. So at least they're getting them off the sidewalk and people's lawns and things like that. So I think that's another big important investment that is kind of necessary from the start to get those systems.
Before the pandemic, do you have any idea how much it cost SACOG or the cities for the trips that happened in 2018 or 2019?
How much it costs for, well,
I think you mentioned about 800,000 trips per year or something like that.
yeah, I hadn't broken it down that way. I mean, for what we spent in the grant funding, there was a grant for about 3.4 million. And then $1 million of that was for site, like station planning and installation of the bike parking. So some of that money went to Uber, and then a bulk of it was to buy the racks and get them installed. And then there was, before that, there was probably another $1 million that was spent like on a consultant contract with tool design to do a bunch of community outreach and equity planning and all that upfront work to design the system. So that, so it would be that, I don't know, 75,000 trips a month for a year and a half. You can do the math, it's about 2 million.
That's not that much. I mean, that's
Right.
okay.
When you compare it to, you know, large infrastructure projects, it's really,
1 mile of lane, 1 mile lane of road.
Yeah.
Okay. You have questions on the
Yeah,
chat?
I actually wanted to ask.
Yeah, of course.
So since we're talking about investment in general, or like increasing bike racks, or like adding a special lane for like really that loud boulevards with like 55 miles per hour speed limits. So I was wondering how it factors into like serving underserved communities, or increasing equities in places that say don't necessarily might be able to afford a $9 trip for a 4-mile drive to
Right.
work. Like, how does the SACOG like address that?
so we have I'm not working on this, so I'll do my best to speak to it, but I can connect you with staff who are working on it. We have a program we're trying to stand up called Engage, Empower, Implement, that is focused on trying to get a funding framework for investing in disadvantaged communities that, so our traditional, let me take a step back, our traditional funding rounds, we say, oh, we have X million dollars available for this 2-year funding round. And we let all of our cities and counties know, and then they submit applications for their projects. And we might have something that's like some percentage of the projects need to be in a disadvantaged community defined by Cal Enviroscreen Screen or whatever environmental justice map we have in our MTP. This approach is to try and help jurisdictions go out to communities and talk to them about what are the investments that you want to see, instead of us saying, oh, there's no bike lane here on Stockton Boulevard, you should put in a bike lane. Is that actually how the community wants the money to be spent? So that is all in the works right now. We're in the process of trying to figure out how we can pay community-based organizations to help us with that. And not, traditionally it's been such this approach of like, oh, well, we'll just ask nonprofits to come like talk to us and help us with this work. Well, now there's just a big focus on like, they're stretched thin, they don't have time, they don't have resources to come volunteer for us, a public agency. So those are some of the things that we're trying to figure out. And, as we kind of think about what do we want to do in bike share, it'll be an opportunity for this work that's happening on Engage, Empower, Implement. We'll be able to do something similar in terms of engaging with those same stakeholder groups and figuring out how we could better build out the bike share system.
Have you guys been in talks with Rebel or any similar companies to bring shared moped style scooters to the region?
We have not. So that would be part of this solicitation, is kind of opening it up to, what are the other device types that are out there? Adaptive bikes have come up a lot too. Cargo bikes, we're really interested to see what other options there are, because I think that those seated scooters, mopeds, have the potential for some even bigger trip reduction, right? Longer distance, a little faster speed. But no, we haven't. We've told Lime that we're interested in whatever they might be coming out with. But at this time, we don't have anything else on the horizon.
And I also wanted to ask what you said just a few questions ago about the curbside parking for e-scooters. Is there, I talked to a planner in San Jose who was trying to use curb space that would ordinarily be red, especially for daylighting, where you can't have parking due to visibility issues.
Right.
But scooters are not going to obstruct sight lines in the way that cars, vans, and trucks would. Is there any kind of thinking along those lines about locating these dedicated parking spaces in daylighted areas where residents wouldn't want them on the sidewalk?
That gets a little more into our city partner wheelhouse, but I do believe that is something that they talked about, is just looking for any opportunities like that where they can put drop zones. I know the city of Sacramento has done a number of those. Not sure if they have been in places that were striped red anyway, but probably. Yeah.
Just to kind of continue the conversation on bike parking, I'm just curious, like, kind of where did that funding go in terms of the parking infrastructure piece? Especially given that it's a sort of stationless system, so you're not really installing specific stations. That's like what has been done in a lot of other places. That's a pretty big investment cost to set those up. But I'm just curious, like, is there other places in Davis that we can point to that, like, oh, that's where that money went, or in Sacramento, or that's Sacramento?
Not as many were installed in Davis. The racks that we purchased are what are called wave racks, and so they, I'm trying to think how to describe it. They come up and there's just like a circle, so it looks more like what a bike share bike might walk to, even though technically you could lock your own bike to it. And so Davis and Sacramento mostly wanted those types of racks to create more of that like station feel to it. But then people weren't really using them that much, so not as many got installed in Davis. There are quite a few in City of Sacramento. They're really all over. I don't know if you've been to City of Sacramento to see some of those. So it was kind of a hybrid approach in that way. West Sacramento ended up installing some more traditional bike racks, so you wouldn't really know where they were, but they're typically like the grid in Sacramento, a little bit south, into like Land Park, the zoo has a big one right out in front of it. Jeffrey, I don't know if you know where the locations are in Davis. I don't actually know.
I know there's one right at the railroad tracks as I believe 8th Street crosses headed east. I believe that one's still right there, and I can't remember, I can't remember the name of that apartment community, but I think that one's still in place. Yeah, I think in Davis, we mostly ended up at the large apartment communities who wanted to give away some of their curb space for bike parking.
So we still have some of the funding available, and there's some that, we're gonna go through this procurement process and see like how the rest of that funding should be spent. But it could be that ends up being more bike parking installed eventually.
Okay, I think I need to bring more bike speakers because you're getting basically all the questions from the quarter. Well, thank you so much, Sabrina.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
My pleasure.
We have questions.
Online.
Online.
We do have some questions online. So, Lyndall Price asks, do government entities, businesses, nonprofits, et cetera, include information on bike share, bicycle parking in directions to their facilities?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the
Yeah,
question?
sure. Do government entities, businesses, nonprofits, et cetera, include information on bike share and bicycle parking in directions to their facilities?
Like directions to the bike parking, I guess?
I think that's what's being meant.
Okay. I know that the City of Sacramento has a shared rideables website where they have quite a bit of information. I know they've also shared the bike parking locations with Lime to try and put those into the app so that as you're using it, you can see where you could end your trip. I'm not sure if West Sac has, they probably have something on their website, but I'm not sure how much of it is about specific parking spots because it's a dockless system, so there's not like specific stations to go to. But generally, they all do try to just promote shared micromobility, but operator agnostic, right? It's not necessarily bike shares.
So we have a couple more questions, and I'm just going to couple them because they're a little similar.
Okay.
So, Lyndall Price asks, what safety data has been collected for bike share and scooters? Also, what changes to policies / laws are needed for optimal access and safety?
Oh, great question. I was chatting with some folks at lunch. The safety data is just pretty limited and hard to get. So I think there are a few folks that have been pretty focused on trying to get, the hospitals to like code for accidents separately and that kind of thing. But I'm not aware, like generally, I don't think there's a lot out there in terms of like scooters versus bikes. It's still a very new field. What was your question?
Changes in laws and regulations for bike safety and stability.
I think that it just goes back to this infrastructure investments and thinking like Vision Zero type investments, right? Where you're designing the road in a way that makes it so those collisions aren't nearly as likely to happen.
And I guess building on infrastructure improvements, Katie Michelle asks, what do you think is the most effective infrastructure improvement to encourage micromobility / biking?
Such a hard one. I think it depends on the place and what's already there in the built environment. How much room do you have on the street and space? But I think the more protected bikeways and trails, I should say, that we have, the better. people feel most comfortable riding on those. And then if it's not possible to make it protected, then making it, bright green or just well differentiated from the car lane is the next best way to go about bringing visibility.
And Joshua Stark asks, you mentioned that bike share doesn't pencil out, and it sounds like scooter share does. What is it that makes scooters more profitable?
From what we've been told, the operations and the capital costs are much lower. If you're taking a van around to rebalance vehicles, you can fit a lot more scooters in it than you can bikes. And the scooters themselves just don't cost as much to buy each individual scooter versus it's like half the cost of what they're paying. And the bikes have more parts to maintain and replace.
And then Lyndall Price asks, to what extent is bike share set up to serve first mile, last mile for public transit users?
I think that's one that we're hoping to get better at in terms of like where the system should be rebalanced. During the pandemic, we really haven't prioritized that. We've been trying to just observe like where people are traveling around and where should we be rebalancing to. And so I think that's going to be, what we're trying to plan for over the next year is how should we be rebalancing given this like different travel patterns that we're seeing.
We have a last question here. They're asking, or they're saying in LA, there's been a lot of public backlash against these micromobility devices because they get left on lawns, crosswalks, etc. Have you experienced any of that in this area, and what can be done to solve the issue?
We've definitely heard from City of Sacramento in particular. They have the bulk of the devices in the region, and they do get a lot of 311 calls about improperly parked devices or devices that are not being rebalanced and they're in the same spot for a number of days. On the flip side, there are a few people who repeatedly call. So I think, you really have to look at how much of it is the community overall is unhappy with it versus a few people who really don't like it. And I think, similar cases people have brought up that when the automobile first came out, people did not like it. And it was this obnoxious thing that nobody wanted around. And so I think as we see more and more of these devices and people, a lot of it comes down to people just need to know where to park them. And so with the not knowing that, people are just doing whatever. And over time, with partnerships with the operators, we'll be able to educate people and make more parking spots more obvious and that behavior will change over time.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.